Oh, let's get started then. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to extend, on behalf of the Cambridge University Italian Society, a very warm welcome for everyone, both in person and virtually. So, why are we here today? Well, Giulio Regeni was a postgraduate student at this university, conducting his PhD with the Department of Politics and International Relations and Girton College, looking into the roles of Egyptian trade unions. On the 25th of January 2016, Giulio Regeni went missing whilst conducting fieldwork in Cairo. His body was recovered along the Cairo-Alexandria highway 8 days later. He had been brutally tortured and murdered. For a number of years now, the Cambridge University Italian Society has organised this memorial lecture to honour Giulio's memory, focusing on the areas of research that Giulio was most passionate about. This year, we're delighted to have with us Professor John Chalcraft, Professor of Middle East History and Politics at the London School of Economics, an incredibly accomplished academic within the field of Middle Eastern studies who has written extensively on social history and politics from below in the modern Middle East and North Africa. So I'm going to hand it over now to Professor Chalcraft, and the format of the lecture will be Professor Chalcraft will give his talk, and then at the end there'll be the opportunity for some questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
So shall I sort of sit just kind of here so the camera can see? Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for that kind welcome. It's such a nice spring evening, I hope it's good of you to come on with a lecture that promises to be quite heavy. So, but it is in honour of the memory of Giulio Regeni, the Italian PhD student who was studying here at Cambridge, who was murdered in Egypt just over 7 years ago. And for 7 years, Giulio Regeni's family, his friends, colleagues, and along with Amnesty International and other organizations and public figures, have sought truth and justice for Giulio. The British Society for Middle East Studies, it's the leading professional association in Middle East studies in Europe, and the largest, at least in Europe, the leading one in Britain. I'm the secretary, and we've taken this case very seriously over the last 7 years, especially in the framework of our Committee of Academic Freedom, and even attending vigils and calling for investigation and justice. And we, along with many of our colleagues in Middle East studies, consider this to be a case involving the rather grotesque violation of fundamental and highly prized and illegal rights, like academic freedom. The Egyptian government have made a series of false and misleading claims and allegations in regards to the case. But we know that Giulio was a researcher, just a researcher, very much a scholar, a talented and hardworking student, aiming to contribute to academic knowledge and carrying out legitimate and important fieldwork like so many other Italians, British, European, Egyptian, Arab, and other researchers in Egypt and beyond. And while the Egyptian regime has gone to grisly lengths to cover their tracks, the Middle East studies community in general, and in Britain and beyond, are as sure as we can be, although no convictions have yet been secured, that Giulio Regeni was targeted and killed by the Egyptian security services. Now, my lecture is about my own work. It's not about the Regeni case. But in giving it, the idea is to honour Giulio in his memory and to send a message of support and solidarity on behalf, especially of British and transnational Middle East studies, to his parents, Paola and Claudio, and to all of those seeking justice and truth for Giulio. So let me turn to my introduction. After a decade of mass mobilization and popular uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa and beyond, this lecture revisits the question of popular mobilization, aiming to explore the meaning of this contested figure in Gramscian perspective. It's based on a book which I'm about to submit a revised draft of to Verso. The book's called From Subordination to Revolution, Popular Mobilization in Gramscian Perspective. The aim is to make a contribution to understandings of resistance, mass mobilization, popular contestation, and revolutionary politics. The book draws on the life and works of the Italian revolutionary communist and intellectual Antonio Gramsci, born in 1891 in Sardinia, died at the hands of his fascist jailers in a prison in 1937, or 6 days after he was released from prison. It also draws on the voluminous research in Gramscian perspective undertaken around the world on popular mobilization. I do think we are in a Gramscian moment, as Peter Thomas called it in a seminal philosophical contribution to the Anglophone literature on Gramsci as long as 14 years ago. And I do see the Gramsci reference as a midwife of intellectual and political renewal, and therefore of history in the making. So that's quite a big claim to think about Gramsci as renewal. And what is that supposed to mean? Well, first of all, consider a number of trends. I mean, we have this very well-known, oh, that's gone wrong.
I mean, if you go back to start slideshow.
See the technology. There we go. Well, Gramsci wrote that in a crisis of authority, when the ruling class has lost consensus and great masses of people no longer believe what they previously used to, then the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, morbid phenomena, sometimes translated symptoms of the most various kind, come to pass. This is a very resonant phrase in the global conjuncture of the present. First, and I'll list just a number of elements, both of in this, what Gramsci might have called a great and terrible world. First, a decade of mass mobilization and popular contestation from Brazil to Hong Kong to Egypt to France and beyond. Second, the failure of many of those mobilizations, especially those in the name of bread, dignity and freedom, as they were in the Arab world, for instance, from 2019, 2011 and so on, to translate into durable progressive transformation, and the lack of the ability of left and progressive forces to unite and to hegemonize discontent. Third, the ascendancy of right-wing populism, morbid symptoms perhaps, from Netanyahu in Israel to Assisi in Egypt, from Trump to Putin, from Modi to Bolsonaro. The ability of the right wing and of conservative and reactionary forces, one is tempted to refer to Gramsci's analysis of the counter-reformation, its ability to hegemonize discontent and translate it into political gains. Fourth, the crisis in the neoliberal capitalist economy, with its financial, ecological, and cost of living dimensions, as well as the way it hollows out democratic and redistributive aspects of the state. Fifth, a couple of formally progressive elements in culture and civil society arguably are losing their luster. On the one side, there's a growing skepticism about the powers of social media and the internet to liberate us. On the other, there's a growing weakness around cultural and identity politics. Some of its dead ends, or the ways it can divide and fragment, and the ways it can be appropriated by the right or by corporations, are increasingly evident. Sixth, there is a renewed political activity, although often embattled, at the party level, involving democratic forms of socialism or eco-socialism. Latin America first, as it were, and then we've seen in Europe and the US, Corbyn, Sanders, Podemos, Syriza, Mélenchon, and others. So perhaps Gramsci's resonant phrase, the old is dying, the new cannot be born, and morbid symptoms abound. And I like to say the new is struggling to be born. And there's some justification for thinking of it that way in the text. But this can help us think about the present. And one of the things about the Gramsci reference is that it has served in many places around the world, all the way back to Palmiro Togliatti's revival of communism in Italy in the 1940s. It served as a reference for political renewal, and the present can be no exception to that. The Gramsci reference, my book contends, can make a political intervention in the first instance, not as negative critique, which we have a lot of, but as constructive, as laying the ground for the articulation of progressive struggles, an organic unification process, which would result in political gains and thus durable historical transformation. How so, you say? Well, we can begin by looking at the divided intellectual terrain on the left. And the book takes two kinds of political and intellectual division on the left to be highly salient in the contemporary conjuncture. First of all, there's the division between those who are above all invested in understanding and unpacking, challenging and remaking the cultural and discursive dimensions of reality on the one side. On the other side, there are those also progressive who are above all invested in understanding and unpacking, challenging and remaking the material relations of capitalism, the class structure and the powers of the state. So on the one side, we have cultural studies in the most general sense of the term, including post-colonialism, discursive and Foucauldian references, intersectionality, the decolonial, and so on. On the other side, we have the critique of political economy, which we recall was the subtitle of Marx's masterwork, Das Kapital, and it includes many kinds of Marxism, ranging, from Thomas Piketty to David Harvey to Naomi Klein, and so on. What's interesting is we can make sense of past and contemporary interpretations of Gramsci on these lines too. On the one side, there is what one might call the Antonio Gramsci of Benedetto Croce, the great Italian idealist philosopher, who is of such significance in Gramsci's time. In this interpretation of Gramsci, Gramsci is seen as a continuation of German and Italian idealism, a neo-Hegelian, a theorist of culture, subjectivity and language, a great interpreter of cultural hegemony, of discourse. Here is the Gramsci of the English literary critic Raymond Williams's resonant phrase, structure of feeling, the Gramsci of Edward Said, the Palestinians' Orientalism with its Foucauldian referent, and the Gramsci of politico-ideological rearticulation, the Gramsci of Laclau and Mouffe, especially in their later work on hegemony and socialist strategy, and on left populism and the construction of the people. That's on the one side. On the other side, so that's a more cultural Gramsci. On the other side, we still have the Gramsci of Marx and Lenin, the revolutionary communist, a Gramsci who's understood as staying within the fold of historical materialism, even in a highly creative fashion, and whose analysis was undergirded by Marx's theory of capitalism and by the significance of class struggle and social emancipation led by the proletariat and its modern prince, as he called it, i.e. a single party organized on vanguardist lines, searching to seize state power and found a new order. So two different Gramscis. And this second Gramsci, one way it can survive all the recent philological studies of Gramsci, because they're quite open-ended, in fact, a lot of them. So you have these divisions between idealism and materialism on the left, and they show up in interpretations of Gramsci in quite a profound way. That's one great division in the intellectual terrain on the left that I mentioned just now. There's another one that the book is sort of preoccupied with. And here it is. On the one side, there's the left of autonomy and autonomism, of horizontalism, of popular self-activity, of self-emancipation and struggle, of spontaneity, of leaderless movements, of the eschewal of all forms of conventional politics of representation. This is a progressive force. It's been present all around the world in the decade of the uprisings just past. It has a much longer history, of course. But it's a left marked by the anarchist tradition in all its great diversity. And one thinks of the work of Harton Negri, for instance, on The Multitude, or David Graeber from the Anglo-American world and his book Direct Action. On the other side, in contrast, there is the left of the party, of the vanguard, of the need for leadership, of the need for coordination, direction, centralization, a left in which ideology and strategy still matters, and state power is still conceived of as something that needs to be tackled, seized, or confronted, often forcefully. And one thinks of Jody Dean's recent book on the party. So there's this division, if you will, between anarchism and vanguardism. It's also played out, it's important on the left, it's also played out in interpretations of Gramsci over many years. So on the one side, there's the Gramsci of Karl Boggs, who was a Gramsci of popular self-activity, of the factory councils in Torino, of bottom-up forms of mobilization. Gramsci never conceived of as an anarchist, but nonetheless someone who paid fundamental attention to popular and democratic forms, and who was very far from scorning spontaneous movements. On the other side, there's the Gramsci of Leninism, or even Marxism, Leninism, of interpreters like John Sambon Matsu, or a Salvadori back from the 70s, Gramsci as a vanguardist, one who understood the vital importance of party, of discipline, of strategy, of intellectual, ideological activity, and the necessity of state power and its seizure and reformation, along with the suppression of empty bourgeois democracy in the passage to communism. So you have these different Gramscis, and we can understand different interpretations of Gramsci in relation to these different understandings of the relative value of autonomy on the one side versus leadership on the other. So these two sorts of divisions, very important at work in contemporary progressive intellectual activity and in interpretations of Gramsci. Now, some people want to say, well, these divisions, they're rooted in, people just aren't listening to each other. They're rooted in some kind of anger or the stupidity of one side or the other. You know, of course, there's plenty of that around, and there's sectarianism and all sorts. But the argument in the book is that actually the division is rooted in fundamental differences in worldview in relation to two great things, the relative status of the ideal and the material on the one side, and that includes a lot of debates. There's a debate, you know, the weight of spirit versus matter, the weight of subject versus object, the weight of theory versus practice, and so on. And then there are relative debates about the importance, debates about the relative importance of autonomy versus vanguard activity. And that's, you know, debates about the party and spontaneity and the place of democracy and the like. So with that sense of what we have in terms of the intellectual terrain on the left and the terrain in relation to interpretations of Gramsci, what I mean then by referring to the Gramsci as the midwife of renewal in the present is that Gramsci and the living and updating Gramscian perspective has, what I want to argue, the extraordinary power, extraordinary, very unusual, to bring about a concrete synthesis of these highly divided positions. And that's what the book argues by referring to what it calls an expansive Gramsci, where Gramsci is an essential past and a living and updating work in the present. And, you know, to give some brief signposts about this, Gramsci was neither above all a Marxist materialist, nor was he above all a Hegelian idealist, but he effected a concrete synthesis of Marx and Hegel. He was neither all about cultural studies, cultural hegemony on the one hand, neither was he all about the critique of political economy, capitalism, and class on the other. In Gramsci, the struggle for a new hegemony involves a battle over the material and the ideal. Further, Gramsci was neither an autonomist nor a vanguardist. His whole struggle, arguably, was to effect an organic, living unification of these two distinct elements. And so this Gramsci does not force us to choose between identity politics on the one side and capitalism and class on the other, between race and class, between sexuality and the state. An expansive Gramsci can be operative within a progressive renewal by effecting an articulation of struggles. So how is that possible? And why is it relevant to this? How does it key into what the book does, which is try to speak about a long journey in many phases from subordination to revolution? So I thought I'll say something about sources and method, because there's sort of three kinds of sources for this work, and one is Gramsci's writings, right? And as you know, part of that's the prison notebooks. Here's just to give you a sense, like this is what the notebooks look like. They're just, after all, it's 29 notebooks. That's all. They run to many thousands of pages, but there's only 29. And this is what they look like. They were written in prison. Here's one of them. That handwriting on the top is probably Tatiana Schucht's handwriting, which was his sister-in-law, who did a huge amount and was an extremely powerful interlocutor actually for Gramsci, and had a PhD in neuroscience and all sorts of things. But anyway, that's what their prison notebook looked like. And this is actually the very first page of notebook one, and it's his table of contents laid out. And these famous prison notebooks, which have had such an afterlife, this is how they're written, just on paper, meticulously, this small handwriting and this, things crossed out, but very rarely, astonishingly, apparently, just sort of written down with very few returns and But and anyway, these prison notebooks, with the life that they've had since, this picture, this is the 1975 4-volume edition in Italian of the prison notebooks. It's the Valentino Gerentana. And it's the Bible, as it were, but you can't use that word, but that's what it is, the Quran, the Talmud of Gramsci, because it's all there. It's the only comprehensive edition of Gramsci's notebooks. There is a national edition promised, the Franconi one, but it hasn't appeared yet. That's the only one, 1975. And it only exists in Italian. But then you have this famous book here, which is the 1971 translation into English, which is the Lawrence and Wishart one. And then there's the further, it's called Selections from the Prison Notebooks, and it just selects a whole load of bits and pieces from here and puts them in here into English. And then there's a second one, 1995, which is Derek Boothman's. So that's as for the English. And then there was a new project, which was this one, the volumes 1 to 3, which is the Buttigieg, a new translation in English. But it only goes to the end of notebook 8. It's a bit disappointing when you come from this, which is 29 notebooks, and this one only goes to 8. But this crew, as it were, with Marcus Green, have done this latest one, which is called Subaltern Social Groups, which is a fabulous critical edition of Prison Notebook number 25, which is the one about subaltern social groups. It only came out in 2021, and it's actually quite a significant piece of work in English. And then finally, there's cultural writings, quote unquote, which includes stuff from the prison notebooks, but also earlier literary criticism and so on. So that's just to give you a sense of some of those sources, Gramsci's writings, but also, of course, that's just a page from Notebook 11. So you can see what it looks like, the Italian version. And this is actually a fantastic critique of positivist approaches to causation, which is extremely live in the present, it has to be said. But and this Investimento della Praxis is his translation of Marx's famous revolutionizing praxis, which comes in the thesis on Feuerbach, etc., etc. But anyway, that's what the Italian edition looks like on the inside. But then these are Gramsci's writings, because they're not just, of course, in the prison notebooks. You've got the selections from the political writings of these two, and then there's his pre-prison letters, The Great and Terrible World, and then there's the prison letters, and then there's bits and pieces from the young Gramsci, and then again the cultural writings I put here too, because it has outside of prison stuff. But so we have all that as well in English to work with. And just to give you a sense, I mentioned philological studies earlier, which is, there's this whole raft of new stuff. And this is especially in Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish that's recently been translated into English. But these are some of the big studies: Giuseppe Vacca, Alternative Modernities, Giuseppe Cospito, The Rhythm of Thought in Gramsci, Gramsci's Pathways, Liguori, this revisiting Gramsci's notebooks, all this work that's been done recently on the notebooks themselves, very hardcore, significant philological type work. And just to give you a sense of how, Michele Filippini speaks about Gramsci as a traveling theory. And just to give you a sense of that, here are some, as it were, case studies, country studies. This is Stuart Hall's analysis of Thatcherism, which is absolutely brilliant, and it's very heavily reliant on Gramsci, The Hard Road to Renewal. That's a 1988 book, but it's still, it tells us a lot. This is about Gramsci's common sense going to work in America. This is in South Asia, Selected Subaltern Studies. Here's a good book on the struggle for hegemony in Pakistan. And here is Nelson Coutinho's book, Gramsci's Political Thought, comes out of Brazil. And it makes good sense of Brazil in one of the chapters. So, just to give you a sense of the case studies as well, and of Gramsci as a traveling theory. So these are some of the sources and materials that are available for a project of this kind. And I suppose my premise is that, because even being, insufficient philologically perhaps, but there's been so much work done now on the notebooks and Gramsci's work that the people like me can come along and make use of that work to think about Gramsci. So that's something about sources and method. So what I thought I'd do here is just try to, the book has 7 big chapters, but to try and condense it a bit, just to say how this reading of Gramsci works in relation to those two big debates, the materialism, idealism, and the autonomy and the vanguard. And I'll just, and so I'll deal with each one in turn, and then I'll conclude. So, to begin with, we have to think of the, I'm going to say how the philosophy of praxis and the politics of hegemony and the history of subaltern social groups, which is the kind of three great pillars of Gramsci's view, arguably, how they overcome materialism and idealism. And then I'll say how in that framework we can conceive of popular mobilization as a long journey from subordination to revolution, a journey in various distinct phases that can help us, and it's that can help us overcome the dichotomy between autonomism and vanguardism. So just to begin with the philosophy of praxis, Gramsci refers increasingly in his notebooks, to something called the philosophy of praxis. And it's sort of interchangeable with historical materialism or the word Marxism up to a point. But then the question is, how interchangeable is it? And, so Giuseppe Vacca, for instance, argues that from the middle of 1932 onward, with the expression philosophy of praxis, Gramsci intended to stress the originality of his own thought. And Cospito's reconstruction argues that the direction of travel in the notebooks indeed is away from materialism and economism of all kinds. And, so Gramsci refers to Marx a great deal, and Marx is dubbed the founder of the philosophy of praxis. But what does that mean? Gramsci's interpretation of Marx is very particular, even unique. And you can capture flavor of this by noting that Gramsci even sees Marx as holding on to a non-materialist philosophy. Here's Gramsci. Marx always avoided calling his conception materialist, and whenever he spoke of materialist philosophies, he criticized them. Marx never used the formula materialist dialectic. He called it rational. Now, a statement like that about Marx, whether accurate or not, reveals for my purposes here the extent to which Gramsci's Marx, Gramsci's founder of the philosophy of praxis, was not a materialist. Gramsci didn't have any time for dialectical materialism and almost any kind, or I think you can say any kind of philosophical materialism. He barely refers to it. He barely makes a single reference in any of his works, as far as I know, to Lenin's philosophical notebooks. So he strongly rejects what he called the idealistic monism of the spirit on the one side, but what he calls, quote unquote, the positivistic monism of matter, along with materialistic monism. Now, Gramsci is engaged with a very extended argument with the idealist philosopher Croce, but he wants to take the best of Croce. He's also engaged in a very extended confrontation with materialism in all its forms, but he wants to take the best of the critique of political economy and use it to overthrow the idealist emphasis on the spirit or on mental activity. The spirit so central in Hegel, mental activity so central in Croce. And here's another, this is a remarkable quotation. The laceration which happened to Hegelianism involving a lapse into spiritualism, so he's saying how Hegelianism degenerated in the 19th century, has been repeated with the philosophy of praxis, i.e. been repeated with Marxism. That is to say, from dialectical unity, there has been a regress to philosophical materialism. So Gramsci's hearkening back to what Frosini calls the brilliant germ, what Frosini tells us Gramsci called the brilliant germ of the philosophy of praxis, which is Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. So he's saying that was the moment where the philosophy of praxis was born, and then since then there's been a regress to materialism. And Gramsci says, he's reflecting on Marx and orthodoxy. He warns against the self-styled orthodox adherents of the philosophy of praxis who fall into the trap and themselves conceive their philosophy as subordinated to a general, vulgar, materialist philosophy, just as others are subordinated to a general, vulgar theory of idealism. In that very same note, Gramsci underlines his view, which is expressed in so many places in the Quaderni, the notebooks, that materialism is of metaphysical origin. while at the same time giving us his most powerful summary definition of the philosophy of practice itself. This is probably the only place where Gramsci defines the philosophy of practice. It's been forgotten in the case of a very common expression, historical materialism. One should put the accent on the first term, historical, and not on the second. Remember, this is the Gramsci who saw Marx as a historian. This is the Gramsci who wanted to say Marx is the author of concrete political and historical works. So here he is saying, what is historical philosophy of practice? Absolute historicism, the absolute secularization and earthiness of thought, and absolute humanism of history. So not materialism then, but humanism, secularism, and historicism are at the beating heart of the philosophy of praxis. So I'm not going to take you now into the proper depth of how that's constructed, but just to savor some of the components of it. You're lucky we don't have enough time to go into all these components, but the unification of theory and practice, of subject and object in sensuous human activity, always historical. A sensuous, this worldly humanism in which the human is not a pre-existing essence, but a kind of work in progress. The human is, as Gramsci calls it, a point of arrival, not a point of departure. Very interesting. A humanism in which feeling is just as important as knowing. And that's a big opening, actually, right there to feminism. An absolute historicism in which the consciousness of history becomes philosophy, or is the meaning of philosophy. A new dialectics, neither Hegelian nor Marxist, in which dialectics is part and parcel of the unification theory and practice, subject and object, a way of understanding how the process works and finding diversity in the apparent uniformity and finding what is common amid what appears to be opposite. That's Gramsci's contribution, as it were, to dialectic. He has also a concept of immanence, which expresses the idea generally of everything is connected, but in a highly subtly interesting and this worldly and earthly way. And he has an emphasis on politics, which is thesis 11 of the theses on Feuerbach, which is, the philosophers interpret the world, the point is to change it. But for Gramsci, you can't complete the unification of the theory and practice without changing practice. So there has to be a politics. It's built in to the philosophy of praxis. This is not the death of philosophy, which is what the idealists call it, what Benedetto Croce called it. It's actually the only way to generate an integral philosophy. Also, you have a this-sided epistemology where proof, truths, it's this-sidedness in practice, and you have an ontology of becoming where inert states of being or essences are ruled out, and everything is either becoming or coming into being or becoming non-being or dying. And you also have this fabulous non-positivist approach to causation, where you have causation is, put it very briefly, thought of in terms of actual social forces which generate a cause through combining subject and object theory and practice and so on, and a very rich perspective on social emancipation. So that's some of the features of this philosophy of praxis. Oppression here is related to the disunity, a disorganic formulation between theory and practice, subject and object. So the idea then is that, not materialism, neither materialism nor idealism are at the heart of this, but this, you may or may not be pleased to hear, is only the philosophico-historical face of Gramsci's worldview. As Frassini writes, it has to be translated into politics, otherwise it won't be completed. And that's where Gramsci's key concept, the politics of hegemony, comes into play. And let me see, what sort of time? Okay, I've got, I'm getting there. What have I got? 10 minutes? 10 minutes left?
Oh, yeah,
I don't want to.
how long you'd like.
Okay, well, so the key concept here is hegemony. But that can't be understood, just to cut to the chase, if we stick to the concept of the determination by the economy or the structure in the last instance, which is, the material foundation of Marxism. You can't understand the concept of hegemony if you stick with that. And just to say, so here's what Gramsci said: it is necessary to combat economism. See, he goes on about this all the time, not only in the theory of historiography, but also and especially in the theory and practice of politics. So theory of historiography probably means historical materialism. In this field, the struggle can and must be conducted by developing the concept of hegemony. So the concept of hegemony is devised to combat materialism and economism. At the heart of it, we might say, is not really the capitalist economy which determines politics. At the heart of it is something that Gramsci gets from Machiavelli. And there's all sorts of funny things here, because Croce calls Marx the Machiavelli of the proletariat. And Gramsci, it's obviously very resonant for Gramsci, this idea. But Machiavelli for Gramsci is the theorist of politics as such. And politics which is, and this politics must combine with and incorporate the economy as one of its vital moments. But it's not the structure which determines the superstructure, but the way the two are combined, which matters. So at the heart of hegemony are power relations, politics, which are comprised of combinations of leadership, domination, coercion and consent, force and persuasion. These are the dichotomies that Machiavelli worked with. And it's an analysis that conceives of hegemony as, and this is my definition, a process of politico-historical unification. So, and that is in relation above all else to leadership, consent, autonomy, and domination. These components are related in a balance and relation of forces, and they include elements of class and group, military, political, and economic forces. So just, I know this is a bit heavy, but it's never easy to define hegemony. And here's the definition I end up coming up with in the book. And so it's that complex combination of, it's 12 moments, which is really, difficult and complicated, but that's just, that's as good as I can manage. But, leadership, consent, autonomy, and domination, a relation and unstable balance of forces that brings about an always incomplete unification of the structure and the superstructure. It's always undergoing various forms of transformation. It's enacted at multiple intertwined spatial scales. Its genetic formation is imbricated in the history, struggles, and relations of social groups and social classes, and it's at all points subtended by the activities of intellectuals. The concepts of the historical bloc and the national popular can help us think concretely about far-reaching and even leading forms of politico-historical unification in hegemony. So now Gramsci has this thing. Politics, he says, is the real critique of philosophy. And so this is how we conceive of how the philosophy of praxis is translated into the politics of hegemony. But the theory of hegemony also contains a theory of history, right? It explains how politics is transformed into history. So that's partly because leadership, the active dimensions of hegemony and leadership, eventually leave documents of their historicity. They leave an infinity of traces, as Gramsci puts it, in individuals, in social formations, above all in common sense and in ways of life. So it contains that theory of history. But then the question, because there's this great thing in Gramsci that a lot of people recognize, which is that that politics, philosophy, and history are a continuous circle in Gramsci. So how is history transformed back into politics? And how is that continuous circle that Gramsci uniquely establishes finally completed? And that's where the history of subaltern social groups comes in. It's this great contribution to historiography in Gramsci. And it's really, that 2021 edition has really helped with this. So we recall that hegemony's genetic formation is imbricated in the history, struggles, and relations of social groups and social classes. These struggles transform hegemony. And in my book, I emphasize the ways we can understand that through the history of subaltern social groups. Because now subaltern social groups are understood as dominated in relation to hegemony, but they're understood. He never quite defines them, but the title of that book is On the Margin. The Prison Notebook 25 is On the Margins of History, right? Subaltern social groups are on the margins of history, but they're also seeking to make history. That's the paradox in Gramsci's theory of historiography, the history of subaltern social groups. You have groups that are on the margins of history, but they're trying to make history. And the history of subaltern social groups is intended to try and capture this complex set of attempts to make history, to transform history, ways of life that are subordinated into politics. And that history is neither materialist nor idealist, and it's marked above all neither by the emancipation of the working class, nor by some process of discursive rearticulation. but it's marked above all by the ways in which those at the margins of history make their own history. They battle their way towards the center, and they overthrow it in a popular revolution through a long journey from subordination to revolution. And that's a process of historico-political unification, and it can found a new hegemony. I did say it was going to be heavy. So, you know, there was an old thesis that the word subaltern social group was just a code for the proletariat, and Gramsci used it to avoid the prison censor. That thesis has been completely discredited. It's not that Gramsci was, of course, he wasn't the predominant 20th century thinker of gender, colonialism, race, and sexuality, but recent philological work has convincingly demonstrated that subaltern social groups, including women, blacks, Jews, Southerners, internally or externally colonized groups, slaves, peasants, and serfs, are included within this category. Gramsci compares American blacks in the early 20th century with Jews in 18th century Europe. He considers the possibility of a future shift from a negative consciousness of a despised race among blacks, which he argued was the result of a struggle carried on by whites to isolate and depress them, I'm quoting. And he imagines a shift to a positive consciousness of a national character. He took note of movements that saw the African continent as a mythic fatherland, Liberia as the Zion of the American blacks, as he calls it, the African Piedmont, with that analogy to Cavour in the Risorgimento. Judy has argued that Gramsci, in ways comparable to W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Afro-American intellectual and activist, completely avoids biological or ethnographic race, and he insists on the historicality of the blacks and their formation. Gramsci's scattered notes on sexuality make very clear that he rejects the claim that sexuality is defined by nature, as well as the colonial connotative articulation of savagery and unbridled or deviant sexuality. Gramsci also clearly adopts a skeptical attitude to calls for a resurgence of masculinism in the face of feminism, and he rejects the way in which the aesthetic ideal of woman oscillates between the conceptions of broodmare and of dolly. And he understands why Nora, leaves her husband in Ibsen's play The Doll's House, and he compares race, class, and gender in relation to subaltern social groups. So in brief, that argument then is that when the philosophy of praxis, the politics of hegemony, and the history of subaltern social groups, the three great pillars of Gramsci's live work, are understood, it's no longer possible to assimilate Gramsci to either materialism or idealism. Let me just see, because I think I'm not sure what happened there. You might have run out of quotations, which I think is fine. Okay, fair enough. So the final piece of this is just to explain a bit about what it means then to speak about a long journey from subordination to revolution, the many passages from subordination to revolution. We say, okay, 5 minutes, I hope. So, because, in this sort of framework, it's possible to reconstruct our understanding of popular mobilization in relation to these three pillars. Popular mobilization defined as, Gramsci defined the popular as the ensemble of subaltern social groups. And he envisaged in that concept of the national popular, and he gets it a bit from Machiavelli, the idea of the formation of the national popular. And so mobilization refers in part to the ways in which the ensemble of subaltern social groups are molecularly reorganized in order to bring about a new form of emancipated community. And so this is in this journey, neither class nor culture takes the lead. And it's a journey in which autonomism and vanguardism are preserved and subladed. They're incorporated in a dialectical and historicist manner. Well, how does that work? So, but just bearing in mind, popular mobilization remakes hegemony. At the center of hegemony, of course, are combinations of leadership, consent, autonomy, and domination. And so in this optic, we can picture or understand the long journey from subordination to revolution as involving four great phases. And those phases begin with the tortuous dilemmas of domination. They move on to new forms of autonomous self-activity. Then they engage with a long search for consent. And that culminates in leadership, a revolutionary phase when a new hegemony is established. And we can derive this way of seeing if we situate popular mobilization within the philosophy of praxis, the politics of hegemony, and the history of subaltern social groups, i.e. within the expansive Gramsci here. It's a kind of historicist, dialectical, humanist, revolutionary, democratic, and communist Gramsci. I know that sounds like a lot, but that's the idea here. And so what that boils down to in the book is treating these sort of four great phases or problematics of popular mobilization in turn. And, I start with domination and its torturous dilemmas. We can speak of a subaltern phase of activity at the margins, a phase which involves capillary and diffuse forms of everyday resistance. And the chapter on the book aims to put on the table the ways in which everyday struggles with domination are conceived in Gramscian perspective. The chapter and the questions are subaltern social groups, the question of common sense, of organic intellectuals, of popular culture, of utopia, of myth, of conspiracy, of Gramsci's fabulous concept of subversivism, subterranean worlds that he speaks about, passive or active adherence to dominant formations, indifference, subaltern formations, contradictory consciousness, and catastrophes of character. And the chapter argues for a non-economistic understanding of objective formation, which is seen as the operative force in this phase. The main argument is to show how a Gramscian perspective seeks to connect with and unify diffuse and daily struggles, forms of everyday popular resistance, without, crucially, either romanticizing them or dismissing them. The second great phase is taken up in a chapter about autonomy, and that argues, I use that phrase, popular self-activity, and the argument is that it emerges from the crisis of authority. And here, we have to talk about questions of class and group consciousness, good sense. Gramsci had this concept of good sense, the spirit of cleavage, which is myth, socialist self-management, the economic corporate, popular authority, self-activity in care and sexuality, counterculture, self-organization, place and its limits, popular uprisings, organic intellectuals, and then the birth of new parties to control popular self-activity. And the main point of chapter 5 in the book is to show that a Gramscian perspective grasps the non-negotiable value and significance of autonomous activity, but also captures and specifies its limits and weaknesses. So the crucial thing is Gramsci does value autonomy as a phase, but he's not an autonomist. And he spends a lot of time railing against autonomists because he calls them anarchists, but he says that they are the intellectuals that will prevent the subaltern moving beyond this phase because they fetishize effectively autonomy and they become autonomists. And so that takes us to the question of consenso. And so chapter 6 in the book takes up questions about how the preservation and sublation of popular self-activity works or does not work in relation to the struggle for consent. So those are the questions about the war of position, about the party, about ideological elaboration and diffusion, about popular education, about eco-socialist economy, about state engagements, about the formation of a social bloc. And the limits of all this, the blockages, are discussed in terms of vanguardism on the one side and Gramsci's concept of trasformismo on the other. If you want to ask about that, well, we can talk about it. But the chapter argues that the struggle for consent emerges out of the potential and discovered limits of popular self-activity. And the main argument then is to show how a Gramscian perspective can envisage a democratic and popular road in the construction of revolutionary alternatives. And finally, the last chapter in the book takes up the popular dynamics of revolution. So it's written under the sign of leadership, or what Gramsci calls direzione. So it looks at the war of position and the danger of the violent revolutionary minority. It looks at the war of maneuver, which is Gramsci's armed struggle, and the danger of Caesarism. It looks at passive revolution on the one side and what Gramsci called the vigorous antithesis to passive revolution on the other. It looks at the ascendancy of civil society, the transformation of the state, the formation of a historical bloc and culture, and what Gramsci calls the organic party. And the chapter argues that the revolutionary phase is made possible by the ways in which civil society and middle and intermediary classes come into contradiction with the state and combine with popular forces. And the main point there is to sketch the dynamics of a popular and democratic revolution against vanguardism on the one side and anarchism on the other. So to sort of conclude then, that to think popular mobilization in terms of a long journey from subordination to revolution in these various phases, and their many sub-phases, is to overcome many fundamental apparent antinomies in Gramsci's thought, and to get us beyond the lionization of either the party, or, for instance, weapons of the weak, or the valorization of one kind of strategy, such as non-violence, over another, such as armed struggle. It is also to enable us to locate struggles spatially and temporally, the better to expand their revolutionary potential. It is to underline and explore the ways in which diverse struggles over race, gender, sexuality, class, and so on can be articulated and brought together. So that's the main arguments in the book. The aim is to make a contribution to understanding resistance and popular contestation. It's hoped that this particular interpretation of Gramsci, in which popular mobilization is understood as the many passages from subordination to revolution, and Gramsci is understood as historicist, dialectical, humanist, revolutionary, democratic, and communist, can be a part of a renewal in the present. Those who take material and ideal relations seriously, and those who see the value of autonomy and of leadership without fetishizing any of those terms, can join hands in the optics of the philosophy of praxis, the politics of hegemony, and the history of subordinate social groups. They can think popular mobilization within a similar live updating framework. And so, perhaps this Gramscian optic can provide an intellectual underpinning of an articulation of struggles, a convergence des luttes, highly relevant where progressive intellectual forces are fundamentally divided, and at a political conjuncture when the old is dying, morbid symptoms abound, and the new is struggling to be born. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, and it looks like it's going to be a really exciting book.
Well, thank you.
And so we're now going to open up to any questions that anyone might have. Yeah.
First of all, I'm not. I've read only tiny bits, so I don't know. I speak as a listener. Okay, I would ask you, for instance, I'm not entirely sure what is meant by historical political unification. And what does it mean, so to say, in practice? And also whether in this concept there is any space for, so to say, checks on power. Because one thinks about, if I think, the first thing I could think of practically, I would think about fascism, which would be quite shocking in a sense, given Gramsci's own history. Yeah. So, first of all.
Yeah.
Secondly, if I can ask another question, I like the idea that the human is seen as something in progress, so to say, something that you aim at. But we could say now that we are in a stage where we are thinking about post-humanism as well. So I wonder
thinking about what, sorry?
We are actually heading towards post-humanism.
Ah, yes.
So is there any space for that, or how would it be disregarded? So thank you.
Thank you. Shall I go straight away for the wonderful questions?
It depends if others want
Right.
to.
Maybe I should, because they're such important questions. When you said
I was looking at something you had in your slide.
it's so politico-historical
I
unification.
think that
Yeah. Politico-historical unification, which is like the shortest definition of hegemony I can think of. And I suppose the reason for that is because it enables you to, the question of leadership, domination, consent, force, persuasion, those contrasts that appear in hegemony. I suppose I thought there had to be a term that didn't just reference leadership and just say hegemony is leadership, because I suppose because it enables us to develop an analysis of leadership. I mean, already in the Greek usage, right, hegemonia, the idea is that hegemony describes a system of power relations that's based on consent type thing. So it already has this idea. So what is going on there? I say politico-historical unification because it's a politics that is trying to make history, right? Because hegemony is a theory of politics, but in the Gramscian scheme, it aims to make history. And one way of thinking of that is that because it's crucial to think of hegemony in this way, that it has both active and passive dimensions. Because the Foucauldian way is to think of hegemonic effects, like we are kind of the subjects of some pre-existing discursive hegemony, and that's, as it were, the passive side of hegemony. But that's as it were, those are the documents of the historicity of previous forms of leadership, previous forms of politics. Remember Gramsci's very resonant points about the infinity of traces, that history and politics has deposited in you sediments from the past, and all these different layers of common sense, the sort of documents of the historicity of previous movements, previous forms of leadership. And so politics trying to make history, politico-historical unification, I mean, that's something of it. And there has to be a way of thinking, you have to think philosophy, politics, and history in a continuous circle. So you have to think of the dynamic way in which each of those terms interfaces with the other. So it's a very fiendish, complex thing. But I think that it helps to think about national, popular, and historical bloc, because they're forms of unification which are slightly less extensive spatially and temporally than politico-historical unification, which equals hegemony. So, it's sort of something like that, which justifies the use of that kind of term. And then the second thing, the thing about humanism being a work in progress, and it's funny because you say reference post-humanism. Foucault said something very similar about homosexuality. He said we have to work at being homosexual. He said we have to work at being gay. Like, we've defined homosexuality as something stigmatized, something we've defined it in terms of the eyes of an oppressive, normalizing discourse. Why don't we work on being homosexual? In the same way as Gramsci, a point of arrival, not a point of departure. And so, but Foucault's often seen as a post-humanist, right? But maybe not. Maybe that can be assimilated, that kind of reading, to a Gramscian reading, which is what I do in the book. Because you can try to spend your whole time proving Foucault wrong, which is what a lot of Gramscians do, or you can sort of say, look, these are different. But there are ways of reading Foucault in a Gramscian respect, which is what I do in the book. So some of these avatars of post-humanism, the human as a kind of discursive effect of this modern disciplinary power, as it were, I think those were exciting for a period. But now I think there are ways of thinking humanism, without those essentialisms. And don't forget that even Marx's, Marx on humanism is interesting. I mean, he's not just Althusser's, anti-humanism. You can't even call Marx an anti-humanist in the way that Althusser said Marx is an anti-humanist. But Marx, he criticized the whole thing, the very interesting thing, the thesis on Feuerbach. Marx says Feuerbach is wrong to say that God is a projection of humanity because he's making an essence out of the human. But he didn't, but then he said, yes, but God is a projection of, the soulless circumstances in which humans live. So you have to transform the secular basis, and then you will transform that illusory projection. So, humanity as a work in progress is there in Marx too, and it's there in the thesis on Feuerbach. So, but I suppose post-humanism, I mean, Yassin Nourani, who's written a brilliant book called Culture and Hegemony in the Middle East, maybe he's a post-humanist, and I co-edited a volume with him called Counter Hegemony in the Colony and Post-Colony. And I suppose he does see humanism as a discursive effect, And I think it's the way that disables a politics, especially in emancipatory politics, that's sort of problematic in Gramscian perspective. As for fascism, yeah, I mean, it's because fascism is a clear and present danger in the present, right? I mean, perhaps not fascism in its 1930s incarnation, but right-wing populism, neo-fascism, reactionary and conservative, the mobilization of all of these languages of authenticity and family values and so on. That's really in the ascendancy. And so, and I think you're right to say, Gramsci had to battle fascism, and that he had to move from what most people agree was an underestimation of fascism at the beginning. There were even positions in the early 1920s where fascism was, social democracy is just one wing of fascism, or fascism is the same as social democracy, right? Which you can argue is underestimating what's going on there. It's just like, the way capitalism restores itself in the epoch of the bourgeois crisis of authority. That's one analysis of fascism. But Gramsci, you can argue that he moves away from that kind of analysis because it's too materialist. And then it goes back to those. So what then is the critique of fascism? And I think that's part of, then you have to look into the philosophy of praxis and the total rejection of kind of genus thinking and purity and essence and order and hierarchy and exclusion of the other, and all of those things that are crucial in right-wing populism and fascism. And I suppose in a very short story, it's a kind of comfort blanket solution to the unification of theory and practice, fascism. So it is a kind of unification, but it's a very hierarchical, violent, and sort of a unification based on genus thinking. It's based on essentialism. So something like that.
Great. Well, I've got a question. So you talk about how obviously a lot of Gramsci's work was written, or like his prison notebooks during his time in prison. Is there so his main ideas, were they established before this time in prison, or did this time in prison, obviously like at the center of this fascist regime, influence his ideas in some way?
Well, it's another great question, and there are those more expert than I. But this Cospito book does reconstruct the rhythm of thought even in prison, and he identifies a whole series of changes in prison, and he identifies a movement from kind of accepting the structure superstructure model and then to rejecting it entirely. My general take on this is I think there's got to be some movement from what people always call Gramsci's idealist and voluntarist youth, right? It's a very established figure in the literature. The idea of Gramsci in his youth was idealist and voluntarist. And he said slightly awkward things like, the Russian Revolution of 1917 is a revolution against Das Kapital, right? So he said that in 1917 in a 2-page article. And he does say things there like, the Russian Revolution is in fact a continuation of German and Italian idealism. Things like that, which are just, they feel like he probably did revise them later. Okay? But my general take is that there is a remarkable continuity. I feel like there's a remarkable continuity. He was starting cultural clubs in 1918 when, half the communist movement was saying, what on earth are you doing? We don't care. We're not interested in your cultural club. We don't care about culture. We're trying to seize power, and he said, no, culture is important, stuff like that. So he never renounced the factory council's idea, which is an idea of autonomy rooted in the direct transformation of production, and the idea of the party is not very present. It's there. So, I think, but then those who try to exaggerate and say, well, during the Biennio Rosso, he was only a man of the councils. Well, that's not true, because he was part of the Italian Socialist Party. And then, sure, he broke with that party and he said it was terrible and corrupted and bourgeois and unrevolutionary. But then he founded a new party. So, the Communist Party, January 1921. So he's still, it's not that he's rejecting the party form, even in the middle of the Mania Rossa. So you can't say at one point he was an autonomist and then he became a vanguardist. That's too simple as well. So, and that's the exciting thing. He went through these different phases. And remember, he began as a Sardinian nationalist. He wanted to throw the continent, the peninsula, what do you call them? The peninsular people into the sea. That was the idea. That was an early Southernism. But he transcended that, and Mussolini and indeed fascists became the avatars of Southernism, and that was part of their colonial policy. And the occupation settler colonialism, very violent, near genocidal settler colonialism in what became Libya after 1911 was that a continuation of that Southernism. Italy is the great proletarian nation that would colonize, build a fourth shore in Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. And Gramsci didn't want to have anything to do with that, which is quite, interesting. I mean, we would like a bit more on it, arguably, looking back. I mean, he called it the Libya War, which feels a little, uncritical, but anyway.
And also another one.
Oh, there's another one in the back over there.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's really fascinating. And also very looking forward to read your books. It is very interesting to think of the popular mobilization you mentioned in the last decade can still be interpreted within history, especially for their failures. So I think one of my questions is, if we're still in that crisis, like the old would already not there, but we haven't had the new ones. So what would be the possibility? What would be the conditions for the new possibility come out? And then the second is, so do you think, is there any limitation for we use within the frame of Ramses to interpret the mobilization now? Any limits?
Great question. So it's a living, updating, but historicizing framework, and so there are always limits, and then limits being sloughed off, right? That's fundamental to Gramsci's sense of how things change. He says you can't live in the wooden integument of old history. and wooden integument is a kind of like a woody husk. There's always shells, as it were, carapaces, things that become ahistorical, that get sloughed off in Gramsci's sense of transformation. And so that it has to be updating, right? That the continuous circle, philosophy, history, politics, has to be updated, and that's why the struggles of class and group will transform it, and they'll transform the picture. And so I think within the framework, feminism, anti-racism, queer politics, ecology, these update the question. They constantly update it, and so the limits are there, but the limits are to be discovered and then thought through. But you still, good question. Enough of that. That's too relativistic. Where does it show? Where does this framework? How does it help think that present? And where should then we be going? Well, see, the point of thinking about the last decade in terms of popular self-activity and the powers of autonomy, but not fetishizing it as autonomism, is to say, well, this decade will be preserved and sublated in some project which will be able to garner a wider form of consent at a more organized level. And so that's, as it were, the direction of travel. If this new that is struggling to be born ends up, being born. We remember, of course, even if it is born, because there's a childbirth analogy going on here, because the morbid symptoms can be the woman screaming in labor. That can be the morbid symptom of the new struggling to be born. And it's quite explicit in Hegel, believe it or not, which is what one of Gramsci's references for that very same passage. And So, but Hegel says, when the new is born, it's still only a child, and he's talking about French Revolution. So even if you have this sunburst, you still then have to go through all sorts of phases to develop. So thinking in terms of phases, there's a lot to do and a lot to work out. But so you say, okay, but then how's that going to be organized? And what I do in the book is maybe it's not original, but there's 3 ways that you can think of organization, maybe in Gramsci at least. One is a kind of a vanguard party, and it's there, right? But it's problematic that it's there. The second is a kind of mass democratic revolutionary party, which is also there. But there's a third thing which is there, which is more exciting. Remember, it's an essential past. It's a past that lives in the present. That's how Gramsci saw how we have to view the past. So that's how he viewed Marx, for sure. So what is that organic party? It's very interesting. He speaks about the organic party, and it's split into all sorts of different elements. It has newspapers, it has intellectual currents, it has organic intellectuals, it has organizations, and it has institutes and cultural developments and all sorts of things. And Stephen Gill, who's looking at the Seattle protests in 1999, he suddenly said, "Oh, what about a postmodern prince? Not a modern prince, but a postmodern prince, because Machiavelli's prince is a sole ruler. Gramsci's modern prince is the Communist Party. But how does Gramsci define it? A complex element in society in which a collective will is beginning to germinate and take shape. Okay, well, that's the modern prince. Well, why can't we think of that definition in the context of Gramsci's concept of democratic centralism, operating in what he calls an organic party, where party doesn't mean, and going back to, you remember, anyone know the original title of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, 1848? What was it called? It was called the Manifesto of the Communist Party. But the Communist Party didn't exist, right? There was learned societies, there was the League of the Saint-Just, there were corresponding people, there was a few intellectuals, there was no party, but there was a party in inverted commas. And that in that kind of organic party, which includes ideology, anyway, so that's the more interesting version of the party, right, in the present, where, but a Marxist or someone who's more, always comes back and says, yeah, but how are you going to coordinate the revolution if that's your theory of the party? And the more democratically inclined is bound to say, but if you coordinate it with a vanguard party, you end up in despotism or splitism or sectarianism or adventurism or hierarchy or something of that kind. So yeah, the organic party, I think, is an interesting, just on the question of organization. Obviously, there's a whole load of other questions that get posed on how, and so so it's a way of, because I remember I was very excited by the horizontalism that was operative in the Arab uprisings of 2011, and I was doing ethnography on the ground, but I realized eventually the reason I was excited about it was because it was an idea. And practice, but also an idea. But the horizontalist is sort of forced to deny the existence of the idea, because that would be intellectual labor, which represents people, which can't be done in horizontalism. So it becomes eventually a sort of contradiction in terms. So that's how, but it needs to be preserved, the value of horizontal forms of radically democratic forms of organization. But how can they be then organized in a way which overcomes some of those limitations type things? So that's sort of, as it were, some of the places that we are. There's a great book coming out by someone called Vincent Bivins. He's a journalist, but he's written this book called If We Burn, and it's based on interviews from Brazil to Ukraine to Hong Kong to the Arab world, and he puts forward very similar sorts of ideas. It's just in press right now. We've been sort of discussing it.
Great. Any more questions?
I have a really broad question, because you mentioned that in chapter 6 there is an analysis of consensus.
Yeah.
And I imagine you talk about how consensus emerges in this community life. and coming from a different background, looking like at networks, theory and consensus, what are the main vectors, let's say, that lead to the emergence of a consensus?
Yeah, no, great question. Okay, so I translate, so the Italian word is consenso, and I translate it as consent, right? Not consensus. Partly just not to be careful about homogenizing it, you know, and also just because it is a work in progress, right? And what the history of subaltern social groups sort of has, it's always a morphology, it's always in becoming in some way, shape, or form. So that has to be really written in. And so there's a lot of, you know, oppositions, distincts, immanent connections going on. You know, there's a dialectics, there's a constant process of finding what is opposite in the apparent uniformity and finding what is similar in what is apparently opposite. And it's out of that, it's a quite an antagonistic process that through which consent can be formed. But the main components are, I mean, it's when the war of position gets going. I mean, that's one of the central concepts, you know, the struggle to organize consent in the earthworks and fortresses of civil society, the struggle to organize the connections between economy, state, and culture in civil society, and the ways in which, through that organization, forms of language, worldview, and, because he doesn't shy away from, you know, politics as rhetoric, as faith even, get disseminated. And so the war of position is like the centerpiece of that, but also styles of organization, which, you know, range from the vanguard to the organic party, and also more specific analysis of the meaning of ideology and what it means to disseminate ideology and how that can be done. And he often has this kind of fourfold. There is a fourfold, you know, there's leadership, consent, autonomy, and domination at work in the process of consent formation. I know that sounds horrible and way too complicated, but that is how it operates. So with the party, you do have a leadership, then you have a kind of middling rank and file, then you have a middling staffs, then you have a rank and file, and then you have everybody else. When Gramsci speaks about the history of a party, it's always embedded in a broader. And so consent can be forged, you know, out of those kind of complex combinations. But part of it is faith, and part of it is feeling. So faith, you know, when he talks about the man in the mass, you know, faith is also a secular concept in Gramsci. You know, people being convinced of certain kinds of certitudes. You know, when he's complaining about the Socialist Party in 1919, he says, no wonder some workers became fascists. The socialists failed to disseminate moral certitudes, you know. And if you think about the success of the right and how, you know, they're capable of disseminating moral certitudes, you know, there's things to think about there in terms of how progressive forces can operate. So some of those, you know, that's a sort of a tentative opening to that question. But it's but the driving force, but it has to be related to the previous phase. So it has to incorporate formally autonomous activism. And so it's partly the autonomous actors themselves who discover their own limits, who then go on to try to win consent. And if that sounds crazy, think about David Graeber's book, Direct Action, right? So this is a book about direct action. It's about autonomy. But then he writes a book, which means, by definition, we're going to be reading it and we're going to be persuaded or not. We're going to be consenting or not to this book. So how does the autonomist escape that question? They can't, but then hopefully that can then lead to something more developed and interesting, where an ideology is being disseminated. So just to say, it has to be situated, but there is a passage from domination straight into consent. Like, people can just join a party, can't they, without any prior political activism. So there's that kind of passage as well. But the expansion of the war of position, it can only operate through incorporating and including previously subaltern elements. That's sort of how it works. So the prehistory of where you were really matters in consent formation. So these phases are intertwined, right? That's why it's so hard to come up with these kind of cut and dried measurable definitions, because you have to situate it within a kind of a stream of a historicist stream of becoming, and what Gramsci constantly calls unification. I mean, he calls it unification, going back to your question, in the history of subaltern social groups. He says there's a process of provisional unification. But it's constantly interrupted, he says, by the activities of ruling groups. And so this is what happens in the history of subaltern social groups. Anyway, so some threads there, but hopefully more developed in the book.
If there are no more questions for anything else, I just have one quick question.
I'll try to be quicker in answering. Briefer.
So you mentioned like the extensions that have been taken with sort of Gramscian theory to things like ecology, sexuality, that sort of thing. Are these sort of extensions things that Gramsci envisaged in his writings, or was he restricted to a sort of in a political sense?
I think we can speak of openings to those thematics. In the way this, I mean, he's constantly. He even says at one point, "I do not know where emotions begin and reason ends in me." Right? He's very sensitive to feeling. What he calls feeling. He calls it feeling, and that's an opening to all sorts of challenges to rationalism and to abstracted forms of rationalism, so that's one kind of opening. I mean, you can see. I mean, Bouet says he lacks. You can see he lacks emotional intelligence in his letters to Julia Schucht, his wife, and to. And it's interesting though. Julia Schucht writes about knowing and feeling in her letters. She's the violinist who married Gramsci. She's Russian. She writes to him about knowing and feeling. It's interesting, and she even says, "I'm okay. I know," she says, "but I have trouble feeling," which is interesting, right there. But so, but Gramsci, at least he puts this question of emotional intelligence on the table. Even you can see him being a bit irascible, a bit rationalist, a bit problematic, a bit patriarchal sometimes, but you can see it's sort of on the table. And he does, he speaks about the complete emancipation of women. And it's very interesting. He doesn't want legislation on feminist questions until the feminist movement is more developed, because he says it will only lead to monstrosities, which is very interesting, in terms of thinking in phases as well, so there's a lot there, and there's openings. It's like a series of openings. You can read it negatively, or you can read it more positively. And the same with the relationship to nature. The Marxist relationship is often about a conquest, right? Which is also keyed into colonial thematics. But there are other gestures, like there's someone called Loftus. He's a geographer, and he's brought out the way in which a praxis in Gramsci can be related to a different kind of ecological view of nature. And then there's sexuality, and he's very interesting. He never says anything about, he's skeptical even of Freud. He says sexual questions are often psychologized, he says. And he always puts it out there and he imbricates it in politics. There's no homophobia, there's a lot going on there on sexuality. And I mentioned a few things on race. But it's this rejection of genus thinking. Marx has a definition of genus thinking in the thesis on Feuerbach, which Gramsci loved, and it's genus thinking is when all the humans in the group are united by some dumb generality, And that's essentialism in Marx. And that kind of genus thinking that you get when you get stereotypes about women, about blacks, about race, about queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, that it always relies on that principle. And that principle of genus thinking is totally rejected in a Gramscian way of thinking. And as I mentioned, the history of subordinate social groups is about objectification, domination, subordination. It's not only about class exploitation. Objectification has a much bigger register, objective formation in Gramsci. So he even defines common sense as a rigified phase in the formation of subordinate social groups, a rigified phase, a kind of solidified form. Anyway, so I better not talk too much. But yeah, so there are openings, but those openings, the whole point is that they have been developed, right, by post-colonialism, by anti-racist thought, but under the sign of hegemony and under the sign of subordinate social groups, and even under the sign of praxis. I mean, if you read Catherine McKittrick's book on Sylvia Winter, who's a Caribbean sort of decolonial theorist, she's very engaged with praxis, and the thematics are not. You can think it in relation to Gramsci. So there's lots of openings and ways that one can update in relation to that very important body of critical thought that's too often too easy to dismiss if you only think about capitalism and class, etc.
Great, thanks very much. And I think we should give Professor Chalcraft another round of applause for a lovely engagement. And I wish you all a safe journey home.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming.